We live in an age of emotional confusion. Men are told to be more sensitive, more emotionally available, more in touch with their feelings. Yet many men who follow this advice find themselves experiencing the opposite of what they expected. Instead of deeper connections, they face rejection. Instead of admiration, they encounter discomfort. Instead of attraction, they generate repulsion. This is the paradox that Jung identified decades before our modern emotional revolution, the difference between emotional maturity and emotional dependency. And this difference determines not just how you're perceived romantically, but how you navigate all human relationships. Consider the contemporary landscape. We see men who cry openly, share their vulnerabilities on social media, and express their emotions freely. Some of these men are respected, admired, even desired. Others are avoided, patronized, or dismissed. What creates this stark difference? The answer isn't found in the emotions themselves, but in the psychological structure underlying their expression. Jung understood that there's a fundamental distinction between a man who has integrated his emotional nature and one who is controlled by it. Between a man who chooses vulnerability from strength and one who leaks neediness from weakness. This paradox exists because what people, particularly women, respond to isn't the presence or absence of emotion, but the level of psychological development behind that emotion. A tear from an integrated man carries completely different psychological information than a tear from a dependent one. The emotion may look identical, but the underlying psychology is worlds apart. Jung called this the difference between the individuated man and the man-child. The individuated man has passed through the inferno of his passions. He knows them, has wrestled with them, and emerged with conscious control. The man-child may feel just as deeply, but he hasn't done the psychological work to integrate these feelings into a mature personality structure. This creates what Jung identified as a repulsive dynamic. When emotional expression comes from psychological immaturity rather than conscious choice, it triggers an instinctive recoil in psychologically healthy people. It's not the emotion itself that repels, it's the unconscious neediness, the unintegrated anima, the projection of responsibility onto others that repels. Understanding this paradox is crucial because it reveals why traditional advice about just be yourself or express your feelings can be psychologically dangerous for men who haven't done their inner work. They're expressing feelings from an immature psychological position, wondering why the results are so different from men who express similar feelings from an integrated position. To understand why emotional dependency repels, we must dive into one of Jung's most profound discoveries, the anima. Jung observed that every man carries within his unconscious a feminine principle. Not femininity in the social sense, but a psychological archetype that governs his emotional life, his capacity for relationship, and his connection to the unconscious. As Jung wrote, every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. This image is fundamentally unconscious. When the anima remains unconscious and unintegrated, something psychologically dangerous occurs. The man begins to project this inner feminine principle onto external women, expecting them to carry his emotional completeness, his sense of wholeness, his psychological stability. This is what Jung called anima projection, and it's the root of emotional vampirism in relationships. The unintegrated man doesn't realize he's doing this. He believes he's being loving, caring, emotionally available. But psychologically, he's asking women to mother his emotional world. He's projecting the responsibility for his inner feminine onto outer feminine figures. This creates what Jung identified as a psychic hook, an invisible demand that women complete him emotionally. Consider how this manifests practically. The man with an unintegrated anima will share his emotions, but there's always an unconscious expectation attached. He's not sharing from fullness, he's sharing from emptiness, hoping to be filled. He doesn't cry from strength, he cries seeking rescue. He doesn't express vulnerability as a gift, he expresses it as a demand for emotional caretaking. Jung was explicit about this dynamic. The anima is the archetype of life itself. But when a man is unconscious of his anima, she becomes a moody, irritable, and demanding presence that poisons his relationships. Women, and psychologically healthy people in general, sense this unconscious demand immediately. They feel the psychic weight of someone trying to make them responsible for another person's emotional equilibrium. This isn't conscious recognition, it's an instinctive recoil from psychological vampirism. The integrated man, by contrast, has done the work of recognizing and relating consciously to his anima. He's developed his own emotional intelligence, his own capacity for feeling, his own relationship to the unconscious feminine within himself. When he shares emotions, he's sharing from his own psychological abundance, rather than seeking to be emotionally fed by others. This is why two men can express identical emotions and receive completely different responses. One is expressing from integration, the other from projection. One is offering a gift of authentic vulnerability, the other is making an unconscious demand for emotional rescue. The woman's intuitive wisdom recognizes this difference instantly, even when she can't articulate it consciously. She's responding not to the emotion itself, but to the psychological structure behind it. Integrated strength versus unintegrated neediness. Jung identified 4 primary masculine archetypes that exist within every man's psyche: the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. Understanding these archetypes reveals why some emotional expression attracts, while other emotional expression repels. It's not about the presence of emotion, but about which archetypal energy is governing that emotion. The king archetype represents stability, wisdom, and protective authority. When the king is active in a man's psyche, his emotions serve the greater good. He can be moved to tears by injustice, but those tears lead to decisive action. He can express anger, but it's righteous anger in service of protection and order. His emotional expression comes from a centered place of responsibility and care for others. The warrior archetype embodies focused strength and disciplined passion. The warrior can feel deeply. Indeed, he must feel deeply to fight for what matters, but his emotions are channeled through conscious purpose. He doesn't collapse under emotional pressure. He transforms it into directed energy. His vulnerability serves his mission, not his neediness. The magician represents wisdom, transformation, and the capacity to see beyond surface appearances. When the magician governs emotional expression, a man can share his inner world as a gift of insight, not a burden of confusion. He understands the deeper patterns at work in his emotional life and can communicate them with clarity and purpose. The lover archetype connects to passion, creativity, and deep feeling, but mature lover energy is not desperate or grasping. As Jung noted, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The integrated lover knows who he is and loves from that centered place, not from a desperate need to be completed by another.
Here's the crucial distinction. Emotional chaos occurs when these archetypal energies are either absent or corrupted by unconscious neediness. The man expressing emotions without archetypal backing is like a ship without a rudder, all motion, no direction. His tears don't serve anything greater than his own emotional release. His anger has no noble purpose. His passion has no conscious intention. Jung observed that modern men often mistake emotional expression for emotional maturity. But archetypal masculinity requires that emotions serve something larger than immediate feeling. The king's emotions serve his kingdom. The warrior's emotions serve his cause. The magician's emotions serve wisdom and transformation. The lover's emotions serve genuine connection and creation. When a man expresses emotions from archetypal grounding, others sense the stability and purpose beneath the feeling. There's no unconscious demand, no emotional vampirism, no projection of responsibility. Instead, there's the recognition of a mature masculine psyche that has integrated its emotional nature into a larger framework of meaning and purpose. The contrast is stark. Archetypal emotional expression feels powerful and centered, even when vulnerable. Chaotic emotional expression feels draining and unstable, even when intense. This is why some men can cry and appear more attractive, while others cry and appear less attractive. The tears are identical. The psychological structure beneath them is completely different.
The woman's intuitive wisdom immediately recognizes this difference. She's not responding to the emotion. She's responding to the presence or absence of mature masculine structure behind that emotion.
Jung made a disturbing observation about modern civilization. We have created a culture of eternal adolescence, men who have achieved physical maturity without undergoing psychological initiation. This is what he called the puer aeternus, the eternal boy, trapped in an adult body but operating from a child's emotional framework. The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, Jung wrote, but most people remain unconscious of their own psychology well into their adult years. The man-child represents this unconsciousness made manifest, chronologically adult but psychologically arrested. How do you recognize the man-child? He seeks comfort rather than growth. He wants to be understood rather than to understand. He expresses emotions to be rescued rather than to communicate. His vulnerability is a bid for sympathy, not an offering of authentic humanity. Most tellingly, he makes his emotional state other people's responsibility. Consider the archetypal patterns. A mature king takes responsibility for the emotional climate of his domain. The man-child expects others to manage his emotional climate for him. A mature warrior channels difficult emotions into purposeful action. The man-child wallows in difficult emotions, waiting for someone else to make them better. The man-child's relationship to emotion is fundamentally narcissistic, not in the grandiose sense, but in the developmental sense. Like a child who hasn't learned that other people have their own inner worlds, he treats others as extensions of his own emotional needs. His sharing isn't about connection, it's about emotional regulation that he hasn't learned to provide for himself. Jung identified this as a failure of what he called active imagination, the capacity to engage consciously with one's own unconscious material. The man-child hasn't developed this capacity. Instead of working with his own psychological material, he attempts to externalize it onto others, particularly women, expecting them to carry the emotional labor he hasn't learned to carry himself. This creates what psychologists call emotional incest, not sexual, but a dynamic where the man unconsciously relates to women as mother figures rather than as separate, autonomous beings.
He shares his emotions not to create intimacy, but to recreate the unconditional emotional caretaking he received or wished he had received as a child. The psychological impact on others is immediate and visceral. Healthy people sense the emotional demand beneath the sharing. They feel the unconscious expectation that they will now become responsible for this person's emotional well-being. This triggers what Jung called the wise woman archetype in psychologically mature women, the instinct to reject inappropriate emotional demands. The healthy woman, Jung observed, intuitively recognizes the difference between a man who shares his heart and a man who wants her to carry it. This isn't conscious discrimination. It's archetypal wisdom recognizing psychological immaturity and protecting against its draining influence. The tragedy of the man-child isn't that he feels deeply, it's that he hasn't learned to be in mature relationship with his own depths. His emotions remain at the developmental level of a child seeking parental comfort, rather than evolving into the emotions of a mature adult capable of genuine intimacy and mutual support. This is why traditional masculine initiation rites existed in healthy cultures to force young men through psychological trials that would develop their capacity to carry their own emotional weight. Modern culture has largely abandoned these initiatory experiences, creating generations of physically adult men operating from emotionally childish psychology.
Now we come to Jung's most hopeful contribution, the path of individuation. Jung believed that every person could mature beyond their unconscious patterns, could integrate their shadow material, and could become psychologically whole. For the emotionally dependent man, this means learning to carry his own emotional weight while still remaining open to genuine connection. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, Jung wrote. This acceptance isn't passive resignation, it's active engagement with one's own psychological material. For men struggling with emotional dependency, individuation begins with a brutal but liberating recognition. No one else can fix your inner world. No woman can complete your anima. No relationship can substitute for your own psychological development. The first stage of emotional individuation is what Jung called withdrawing projections. This means recognizing when you're unconsciously expecting others to manage your emotional state, provide your sense of worth, or complete your psychological wholeness. It means catching yourself in the act of making your internal weather someone else's responsibility. This process is initially terrifying because it means facing your own emotional depths without the promise of rescue. It means learning to sit with difficult feelings without immediately seeking comfort from others. It means developing what Jung called the capacity to be alone. Not physical isolation, but psychological self-sufficiency. The second stage involves developing a conscious relationship with your anima. Instead of projecting her onto external women, you learn to recognize and integrate your own capacity for feeling, intuition, and emotional wisdom. You develop your own emotional intelligence rather than seeking emotional intelligence from others. Jung was clear about this process. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. The man undergoing emotional individuation discovers that his neediness wasn't really about loving others. It was about the barriers he had built against loving himself completely. As this integration occurs, something remarkable happens. The man's emotional expression begins to change quality. Instead of sharing from emptiness, he shares from fullness. Instead of expressing emotions to be rescued, he expresses them to create genuine intimacy. His vulnerability becomes a gift rather than a burden, strength rather than weakness. The individuated man can still feel deeply.
Indeed, he feels more deeply than before because he's not defending against his emotions or projecting them onto others. But his feeling serves conscious purposes: connection, creativity, service, and growth. His emotions have been integrated into a mature psychological structure. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of holding the tension of the opposites. The individuated man can be both strong and tender, both independent and connected, both emotionally available and psychologically self-sufficient. He doesn't need to choose between being emotional or being attractive. He's learned to be emotional from an attractive psychological position. The impact on others is immediate. When a man carries his own emotional weight while remaining open to genuine connection, he becomes what Jung called a magnetic presence. He doesn't drain others' energy, he enhances it. He doesn't demand emotional labor, he offers emotional gifts. Women, especially, respond to this integrated masculinity because it represents what their own archetypal wisdom has always been seeking: a man who is emotionally intelligent without being emotionally dependent, vulnerable without being needy, strong without being closed.
We end where we began, with the paradox of emotional expression. But now we understand that the paradox dissolves when we recognize the difference between conscious vulnerability and unconscious neediness. This distinction isn't just theoretical, it's the practical key to emotional maturity and genuine human connection. Conscious vulnerability is what Jung called authentic being, the capacity to share your inner world from a place of psychological strength rather than emotional desperation. The consciously vulnerable man knows his own depths, has done his own psychological work, and shares his humanity as a gift, not as a demand for rescue. What does this look like practically? The consciously vulnerable man can express sadness without making others responsible for comforting him. He can share his struggles without turning others into his therapists. He can reveal his fears without expecting others to make him feel safe. He can be emotionally present without becoming emotionally dependent. Jung observed something profound about this quality. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The man who has reached conscious vulnerability no longer irritates others with his emotional expression because he's taken full responsibility for understanding and integrating his own psychological material. This is the light at the end of the psychological tunnel. The journey through the inferno of your own passions, the one Jung insisted was necessary, doesn't end in emotional suppression or masculine hardness. It ends in integrated strength. It ends in the capacity to feel deeply without losing yourself, to be vulnerable without being needy, to be emotionally available without being emotionally vampiric. The tragic irony is that many men avoid this journey because they fear it will make them less masculine, less attractive, less powerful. Jung understood the opposite was true. The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. The man who has integrated his emotional nature becomes more masculine, not less. But it's a mature masculinity that includes rather than excludes his full humanity. This integrated man becomes what relationships actually need: someone capable of genuine intimacy without emotional dependency, someone who can hold space for others' emotions without losing himself, someone who can love from strength rather than from neediness. And here's Jung's final gift of hope. This transformation is available to every man willing to undertake the work. The capacity for emotional integration isn't reserved for the naturally gifted or the psychologically privileged. It's a developmental possibility that emerges from conscious engagement with your own inner world. The path isn't easy, Jung never promised it would be, but the alternative is remaining trapped in emotional adolescence,
wondering why your deepest attempts at connection create distance, why your most honest emotional expressions generate discomfort, why your sensitivity repels the very people you want to attract. As Jung wrote in his final letter, the privilege of a lifetime is being who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires passing through the inferno of your own emotional immaturity and emerging as an integrated human being capable of conscious vulnerability, authentic strength, and genuine love. The choice, as always, is yours. The path of individuation awaits.
If this moved something inside you, stay. We're building something for those who don't fake it. Subscribe, not just for the content, but for the confrontation. And if this left a wound, maybe it was meant to. Sometimes the best way to go deeper is to share the pain. Share it. Someone out there is still confusing neediness with love. Still mistaking emotional chaos for depth. Still wondering why their heart repels the very people they're trying to reach. Jung's warning wasn't about becoming cold, it was about becoming whole. Because when you carry your own weight, others don't have to. When you love from strength, others can finally breathe. When you stop bleeding on people who didn't cut you, real intimacy becomes possible. The man-child in you might resist this, but the man you could become, he's been waiting.